Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar with Jinsa. So we will be talking about Gaza and the roadmap for implementing the comprehensive plan that was agreed to last week. On July 30th, the Board of Peace announced that Hamas had agreed to give up its weapons and relinquish any role in Gaza's governance and security. President Trump described this as a historic agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and all other armed groups in Gaza. This agreement, called a roadmap for completing the implementation of President Trump's comprehensive peace plan for Gaza, true to its name, is aimed at facilitating phase two of the comprehensive plan agreed to in October 2025. As such, the roadmap establishes a framework for Hamas to decommission its weapons and transfer all governance and security functions to Gaza's interim technocratic committee, called the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, or NCAG. It also called for complete IDF withdrawal in phases. Per the roadmap, the International Stabilization Force, or ISF, a multinational force authorized by the United Nations, will be deployed to Gaza as a peacekeeping buffer force between the IDF and NCAG-held areas. In today's webinar, we'll be addressing where we're at with the roadmap, looking at challenges to implementation, as well as risks and opportunities, trying to discuss whether the roadmap poses a credible path forward for Gaza. I am extremely honored to be joined by our three expert panelists today. First, we are joined by IDF Major General Yaakov Amidror, who is JINSA's Gumunder Center Distinguished Fellow. He was formerly the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel. We are also joined by John Hanna, JINSA's Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow, the former National Security Advisor to former U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney. John headed JINSA's Day After Work, which published a major report on Gaza's day after in February 2024 as a joint project between JINSA and the Vandenberg Coalition. Lastly, we are joined by Ahmed Al-Khatib, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and founder and director of their Realign for Palestine program. He is also the author of the recently published book, Hamas and its 2 million hostages. Before we dive into the discussion, I would like to remind our audience that I will be opening the conversation for audience questions at the end. So throughout the discussion, please do feel free to send me any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A function over Zoom, and I will do my best to address them near the end of the conversation. So with that, let's dive right in. Ahmed, I would like to start with you. I wanted us to break down Hamas's decision to agree to any voluntary disarmament. What's going on? How should we understand why Hamas felt it needed to agree, and why now?
Well, good to be with you. I think Hamas is facing an existential crisis of epic proportions. If you step back and look regionally, the Islamic Republic of Iran, its chief backer, is facing crises of its own. It's unable to support it at levels like pre-October 7th. If you look at the state of Qatar, unable to send its LNG shipments, liquefied natural gas, through the Strait of Hormuz. The Turks are seeking the F-35s. The Egyptians are tired of having the instability on their eastern flank. Then you have the group itself with the population turning against it en masse due to the consequences of October 7th, due to the totality of 20 years of Hamas's failed rule in Gaza. You have no horizon for a political resolution, no IDF withdrawal. Most of Gaza now, about a third are squeezed into a third of the territory. The arsenal that Hamas has of its weaponry is very finite. It is unable to replenish it through smuggling or through domestic industries. They were able to remanufacture some IEDs from unexploded Israeli munitions using some wires and pipes from destroyed buildings. But beyond that, they don't really have the capability that they once had to challenge Israel militarily or to hold on for very long. And then financially speaking, they're in dire straits. We keep hearing about their ability to recruit these boys, these teenagers, to refill their ranks, but they're unable to train these young soldiers. They can't even train them on how to shoot AK-47s because they're worried about depleting their rounds, and the Israelis would target them. And so, whether at the military front, strategically in the region, geostrategically, whether it be with the population, whether it be internally, there's actually a lot of internal fissures within Hamas that they're being coerced into having to take a decision that would have seemed unimaginable just 10 months ago when the ceasefire was signed in October 2025. And I believe that although Hamas may have started this pathway towards disarmament, thinking they're going to play games, thinking they're going to potentially pull a fast one on the International Stabilization Force or the Board of Peace. What we saw the Board of Peace come out with a few days ago, and Prime Minister Netanyahu affirming that there will be no withdrawal beyond the yellow line until the process is complete, shows that the world is not going to play any games with the disarmament plan that Hamas agreed to already. So I believe that they're actually committed to this process and that there's no turning back at this point.
Great. Thank you so much for those insights. General Amidror, I would like to turn to you next. I'd like to get your perspective on Israel's reaction. How surprised was Israel by the announcement that an agreement had been reached? And what are Israel's primary concerns and reservations?
It's an agreement between the Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt, and the new administration. Israel does not have any obligation to this agreement. We are committed to the 20-point plan of President Trump, as was declared by the government of Israel. And after the meeting between Mr. Maldano and the Prime Minister, it's clear that Israel is not retreating from the obligation. But we want it to be as was promised in the 20 points. For example, the agreement between the mediators and Hamas speaks about the light weapon. Guys, the atrocities of the 7th of October was made by Hamas with light weapon. They didn't use any guns. No big guns. It's Kalashnikovs and from time to time RPG, but most of the atrocity was done by people with Kalashnikov. Kalashnikov is a light weapon in every definition that I know. So that will remain with Hamas. Israel cannot agree to that. Who is killing the Palestinians in Gaza today? If someone is courageous enough to say something against Hamas behavior in Gaza, Hamas is killing them with knives and Kalashnikov, not heavy guns. So the whole story about giving back the heavy gun is a joke. It's not serious, and Israel will not accept it. About the retreat of the IDF from the Gaza Strip, that will happen if and when Hamas will be totally dismantled. We are not going to give Hamas more area to control with the light weapon by taking the IDF close to our borders. By the way, I know that some people around the world think that after the elections, if Bibi is not winning, it will be easier. I have a big surprise for you. There is huge consensus within Israel. I think that all the candidates agree that Israel should not give Hamas the ability to survive with weapon, light or heavy, and that the IDF would not be taken out of the Gaza Strip without totally dismantling of Hamas from all its capabilities. And it's very nice that there is an agreement between the Qataris and the Turks and Hamas. Israel is not part of it, and it's not making any move to implement it.
Great. Well, thank you, General Amidror, for helping to set the stage on how Israel is viewing it and their stance. John, I'd like to turn to you as well. With your experience in U.S. policymaking and national security, what do you think the surprise announcement of the deal, particularly in the middle of the Iran war, says about U.S. policy toward Gaza and the Palestinian issue more broadly.
Thanks, Serena. Listen, I have to admit, I was astonished that this agreement came. I mean, this is 9 months after the initial announcement of President Trump's peace plan, 9 months in which nothing seemed to happen. I was entirely convinced that Hamas would never even agree, much less implement, but even agree that it would effectively surrender any security and political role in Gaza and agree to a process for decommissioning its weapons depots, its production facilities for weapons, its plans on the tunnels so they can be destroyed, as well as making reference, obviously, to Hamas police handing their weapons over to a new non-Hamas civil administration and to some process for handling light weapons, licensing, registering light weapons, prohibiting light weapons in the hands of certain people, the decommissioning of militias, not just Hamas, but all other armed factions in Gaza. Let's face it, if you had asked me to bet $1,000, would Hamas ever agree to the terms that are in this roadmap? I'd say no way. They won't even agree to it, much less ever implement it. So I'm surprised. I'm pleasantly surprised, and I think it does suggest both what Ahmed said about the dire straits Hamas finds itself in, the tremendous military pressure it's under, has remained under in Gaza, the fact that its main international sponsors are fed up and want a different way forward and are applying pressure, but also to the fact that despite people believing the Trump administration has no capacity for follow through on its big announcements, that the United States, through various emissaries and the president's authority, has stayed engaged on this and has pushed it forward. And lo and behold, we got this surprise announcement last Friday. So I'm, of course, like everybody, unbelievably skeptical that this can be implemented. And yet, again, as I was last October, when the president was able to get that deal in which Hamas surrendered all of the hostages, which I didn't think they would ever surrender that piece of leverage. But the factors came together, the United States pushed, and we got that first phase of this agreement. And now we have Hamas signing on to this potential for a second phase implementation, voluntarily disarming and agreeing to give up its weapons and to give up any kind of role politically or security wise in Gaza. So I think it's, very, very cautiously optimistic that the stars are aligning in a way that we are going to continue to further weaken Hamas, whether that's 50% of its weapons and tunnels and production facilities, 50% of its light weapons getting handed over, some new Palestinian administration beginning to establish itself as an alternative to Hamas governance, or whether it's 100%. I don't know, but I'm optimistic we can continue to make progress to hopefully undermine and weaken Hamas and other terrorist factions inside of Gaza. So I guess that's how I would start on this, and that I wouldn't have predicted 8 or 9 days ago before this announcement that we would have such an announcement, and now we do. So while being cautious, I think it's in a landscape where there's lots of very, very bad news. This was a welcome development that I hope everybody can continue to try and push forward on and get agreement on.
Great, thank you so much. John, I'd actually like to stick with you on my next question here. Just fleshing out something that you had mentioned. Could you talk about the key challenges or obstacles you foresee in implementing the roadmap, all those bumps that will need to be overcome to make some progress or completely implement it?
Well, I mean, there's so many of them. First of all, it'll be interesting to get General Amidor's view on this, but the at least as presented, it does require Israel and Hamas both to agree that to this roadmap in order for it to begin moving forward. Obviously, the initial phase calls for a complete cessation of offensive military operations and preparations by both sides, which, as we saw in the immediate days after this announcement, where there were clashes, that's going to be very difficult to get everybody to stand down in an environment where there's so little trust. And Hamas is one has to believe that the only incentive Hamas has here is to play for time. They're under pressure. They want to deflect that pressure in hopes that attentions will move elsewhere, and they won't be required to eventually to implement this deal, and that they'll be able to get a breathing space and reconstitute. But the immediate issue, once people agree, is that we get 14 days or perhaps a little longer. We're already a week past this announcement of the deal to have develop a timetable and implementation mechanism for how the roadmap is going to proceed forward. So, how long will that take? What will that involve? We don't know. Obviously, then once that timetable and implementation mechanism is developed, there's going to be the emergence of some kind of verification committee made up of people from the Board of Peace, from the International Stabilization Force, and from the guarantors, the mediators, the Qataris, Turks, Egyptians, Emiratis, maybe, would all be part of this verification committee that's going to have an enormously important role in determining, that people are beginning to implement their obligations under this timetable and mechanism before we can move on to any additional phases of the roadmap. You've got to get the NCAG, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, which for 9 months has been sitting in Cairo, unable to even get into Gaza. They then have to deploy into Gaza and start exerting some kind of administrative authority, and then eventually become, with the new Palestinian police, who have to be cleansed of the any existing Hamas police that can't pass a vetting process. They have to establish some authority, and then eventually, I don't know if it's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year from now, somebody's got to start collecting weapons and beginning to implement this disarmament and demilitarization phase, in which Hamas and other factions and other militias inside of Gaza begin to hand over first heavy weapons, the weapons depots, production facilities, the tunnel plans for the tunnels that can be destroyed, and then eventually moving on to what General Amidor cited as perhaps one of the main obstacles, the ultimate disposition of light weapons. So again, we don't have a timetable for any of this. It could be years. Northern Ireland took absolutely years to get the IRA to eventually hand over all its weapons. So this is only the very, very beginning of a very long process, and in so many different places it can go wrong. Obviously, there issues of how the Israeli withdrawal will proceed in phases, what its real relationship to the decommissioning of the militias will be. I've got to say, throughout this process, I think it's been quite unclear. Is this going to be a step-by-step reciprocal process in which there's some decommissioning and then some Israeli withdrawals that occurs with that? As General Amidor said this week after a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the head of the Board of Peace Gaza Committee, Nikolai Mladenov, said, no, Israeli withdrawal will only happen once all of the decommissioning process, light weapons, heavy weapons, tunnels, etc. Once that's completed, that's when the IDF begins to move back from the original yellow line toward green line Israel. So many places where this can not proceed, where it can break down, where it can be delayed. Too numerous to mention even.
Well, certainly a lot of challenges, but John, thank you for that great overview. General Amidor, I'd like to turn to you and give you a chance to respond to what John was saying. I know he brought up many challenges, but what you see as the primary obstacles, and specifically this issue of sequencing Israeli withdrawal and Hamas disarmament, if you do see some way to overcome this dilemma, a way forward, and of breaking down Israel's perspective on some of the issues John had mentioned. General, I apologize, you're on mute.
In Israel, there is, at the end of the day, one demand, that an organization like Hamas will not exist in the Gaza Strip. We don't want to face threats from organizations like Hamas in the future. It's very simple. And this is why, for us, the decommissioning of Hamas is so critical, and Islamic Jihad, and any other organization that exists in Gaza. And from our point of view, we cannot ease the security arrangements that we have after the war inside Gaza Strip before the decommissioning of Hamas, and when we can be sure and we can guarantee our people around Gaza Strip, what we are calling the envelope of Gaza, that they are not facing threat in the future. They will not remain there if there is a threat from Gaza. So it's very nice words, handling and storing and blah, blah. Who will have the key for the stores in which the weapon is? Can we trust Hamas? No. Can we trust Qatar? No. Can we trust Turkey? No. Two countries which are now hosting the leadership of Hamas, helping Hamas, financing Hamas, advising Hamas, letting Hamas to act from Turkey to organize terrorist operations in the West Bank. Can we trust Turkey? No. So with all due respect to the relations between Turkey and America and Turkey as member of NATO, Turkey today is the biggest supporter of a terror organization called Hamas. From our point of view, Turkey cannot be part of the new arrangements in Gaza because they are supporting Hamas. And we don't want a country which is the biggest supporter of Hamas today, with Qatar, to be one of the guarantors for the next situation in Gaza, in which we don't want to face the same threats that, thanks to Turkey and other countries, we had in Gaza. So it is more complicated. It's not just between Hamas and the new administration, Palestinian administration, and Nikolai Maldanov organization. It is about who is in Gaza in a situation that can control the whole decommissioning of Hamas, and the next phase in which the weapon of Hamas will be neutralized technically or by putting it in places in which Hamas cannot get it. And there is one big question for the future. What happens if Israel identify preparations to re-establish Hamas organization like Hamas organization, something like that in Gaza? What Israel can do when we identify a factory in which they are producing weapon systems? What we can do when we identify the meeting of the next leadership of Hamas inside Gaza? All these arrangements should be within the framework of the new agreement, which the mediators didn't have with Hamas or with the United States of America. And our obligation is to the 20-point plan of President Trump, not to the agreement which was reached between the mediators and Hamas. With all due respect to the mediators, I don't have respect, and Hamas, for sure, I don't have respect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that, General Amidror. Ahmed, I would like to turn to you now. General Amidror had mentioned this issue of a lack of trust of Hamas. Hamas under stress has long dangled cooperation in a bid to relieve pressure and gain time, only to breach its commitments. In addition, it sees as its raison d'etre being the armed resistance to Israel. So I'd like to kind of take your thoughts on this. Do you see a way in which Hamas would cooperate with its disarmament? Is there any reason to expect Hamas would comply?
Well, I think that, I mean, in addition to them being coerced, one incentive that they have right now is that there might be elements of Hamas thinking that they're going to evolve to become a political entity. I've seen reports from journalists close to Hamas in Arabic, in Palestinian media, that suggests something akin to we've done what we can with armed resistance. We've hit a ceiling. This is all we can do for now. And if armed resistance is something that future generations are going to have to contend with. But we will continue as Hamas to, operate in the scene and to be relevant and without actually giving details on what that looks like. My thing is that I've been using the metaphor of there is no olive oil without olives. I believe that there is no Hamas without arms, without the armed resistance narrative. Otherwise, they just become another Fatah or PLO 2.0, or they become like the Marxist-Leninist PFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and all those Soviet-sponsored organizations that ultimately faded into irrelevance despite them hijacking airplanes, taking Israeli hostages.
Looks like you froze.
Ahmed, I apologize. You froze on our end. Are you able to hear us? I will send Ahmed a brief message and then we will continue the conversation.
Some kind of a split within. Oh, I think you lost me for a bit, but now I'm back.
Wonderful. All right. Well, you were just, when we cut off, at least on my end, we left off with you talking about how Hamas without arms would essentially become more like PLO Fatah. So I'd love to hear the rest of your thoughts.
But so could we see a splintering of Hamas in Gaza where, like, what happens if a terror attack happens inside Israel or in the West Bank? Is Hamas going to endorse that armed attack in the West Bank, even though it's disarmed in Gaza? So what's the relationship going to be between Hamas in Gaza versus Hamas in the West Bank? I believe strongly that Hamas is viewing this as an attempt to reinvent itself. But what I don't actually, but I think they're overstating the possibility that they could be relevant as an organization that is despised by the majority of the population in Gaza, that has shown the failure of armed resistance, that has wasted Gaza's potential. I don't think anybody in their right mind in the Palestinian territories is going to elect Hamas again after 20 years of failures. I don't believe that Hamas without armed resistance has anything, at least the PA, however much the Palestinian Authority, however much they're promoted as being sellouts, as being treacherous, as being cooperators with the Israeli occupation, etc. At least they bring international aid, salary, stability, law and order to the best of their ability. What does Hamas have? Its Islamist narrative has failed. Its allies, Iran, are on their back feet. It's part of the Muslim Brotherhood that is widely rejected in the region, except for Turkey and Qatar. It has shown that armed resistance is going to get Gaza destroyed. So anyway, but going back to then the question of sequencing, I actually think this is really important. One of the reports I've been seeing, for example, and this concerns me, is that Hamas might be buying time thinking that, okay, we're going to have the elections in not just Israel, but they're looking at the midterm in the United States. They're looking at some of the candidates that are coming up in the US Senate and US Congress and thinking this could generate greater pressure on Israel to acquiesce, to withdraw, if Israel wants to maintain foreign aid. But one of the other things that they're looking at too is that because this process is going to take a long time, they could sit this out until 2028 when there could be an incoming Democratic administration that would be seen as much more likely to be hostile towards Israel and force a withdrawal out of Gaza even before the process of disarmament is complete. And so that's what concerns me, is that in an effort to preempt Hamas's games, there must be pressure by the United States, by the allies, by the global community to accelerate the timeline, to actually allocate the resource. Who's going to pay for the International Stabilization Force? Who's going to pay for the Palestinian police force that needs to be trained? The United Arab Emirates just allocated $100 million about a month and a half ago, or almost 2 months ago, to the new Palestinian police force to be trained by NCAG. My understanding is that none of that money has been dispersed. My understanding is that none of the Palestinian candidates, there were the police force, the new police force from Gaza, they wanted to hire 5,000 officers. There were 78,000 applicants from Gaza. And I know a ton of those applicants myself. I have an army of contacts in Gaza. My brother is in there. No one has been contacted by NCAG for vetting, for processing, for training, to be sent to Jordan or to Egypt for training. Why hasn't that been done already? Why are we announcing all of these ambitious plans and we haven't enacted anything? We haven't even started training the cadre of Palestinians who are supposed to replace Hamas as the policing force. We haven't started actually talking about the rules of engagements. I've talked to Board of Peace officials. I'm in touch with elements of the Trump administration. It's like, this is very frustrating for me because we've spent the last 9 months basically waiting for a miracle. There were efforts here and there to stabilize Gaza with let's flood it with commercial trucks, let's flood it with humanitarian aid, but also the commercial trucks. Surprise, surprise, Hamas was taxing each truck from 30 to 50% per truckload. And I worry that I haven't seen any major announcements since last week or any even indications of a serious timeline for bringing in anything beyond the troops from Kosovo or beyond the few troops from Morocco that are going to be part of the International Stabilization Force. I haven't seen anything beyond that logistical Humvee vehicle that is going to be deployed into Gaza. So that, I would argue, to me, honestly, is a much bigger concern, because for the time being, Hamas is saying yes, but are we going to inadvertently enable the success of Hamas's original strategy, which is to buy for time, by being delayed due to financial, logistical, and training hurdles.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. That's actually a great segue into what I was hoping to talk about next, which is, I mean, disarmament is obviously one of the major elements of the roadmap, along with Israeli withdrawal, but it also says that Hamas will transfer all civilian governance and security functions to Gaza's interim technocratic committee, talks about this newly trained Palestinian police force, as well as the ISF. So Ahmed, I'd actually like to stick with you for another question before I turn to General Amidror and John. I'd like to talk a little bit more about transferring power to the NCAG. How do you assess the NCAG's ability to, again, this is the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, the Interim Technocratic Committee. How do you assess the NCAG's ability to provide civilian administration for Gazans? What are the main obstacles standing in the way of the NCAG operating effectively? And is there any reason to worry of a Hezbollah in Lebanon-like situation where Hamas retains significant influence behind the scenes?
Precisely that, the Hamas, where Hamas can reign, it doesn't rule, but it reigns basically. Look, I know a lot of the folks in NCAG. I know personally Dr. Ali Shat, the head of NCAG. I think he's an honorable, kind, incredible man. I think the model of NCAG is very compelling in principle to try to actually bring to the surface compelling, professional, nonpartisan Palestinians who could have a role in creating new political culture that's non-factional. In Palestinian life, political life, if you want to exercise politics or to even be an administrator, you have to be a part of Fatah, you have to be a part of Hamas, or you have to have an affiliation with Islamic Jihad or the PLO or this group or that group. There's very little in the form of truly professional, independent Palestinian political life. And this is where I hope that the transformation in Gaza, beyond just rebuilding Gaza, that Gaza becomes the fulcrum for the transformation of Palestinian society, Palestinian identity, the Palestinian national project, to actually create something new other than the last 80 years of failures, of repeating the same mistakes, the same narratives over and over. In theory, NCAG is a good vehicle for that. Because I believe when people ask me all the time, well, Ahmed, where are the Palestinian leaders? Where are the non-radical Palestinians? And I believe they are there in massive numbers. The problem is they haven't been given the safety, the support, the opportunity to rise up and actually govern, deliver, and even engage Israel at a professional, nonpartisan level. Beyond the rhetoric, a lot of Palestinians, they want good relations with Israel. They want to actually have functional governance that's about integrating Gaza with the Arabs and with Israel. That's about turning Gaza into the crown jewel for the Palestinian people that makes up for 20 years of wasted time since the 2005 disengagement of Israeli settlements. I left Gaza 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, a time of immense hope and optimism. And we saw basically the degradation and Hamas's rise to power and the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit and the blockade. The very day of my asylum interview in the United States was June 14th, 2007, which is the very day that Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. I was the first Palestinian to get asylum here because of Hamas's control. I'm using my personal story simply to signal that there are many Palestinians ready to actually work and do wonders. The problem with NCAG is that they've been locked into a hotel. They cannot speak to the media. They cannot speak to the Arab or international committees without the presence of an embassy staff from the United States Embassy. They haven't been able to speak to the people of Gaza, to just message, to say, this is what we want to do. This is our vision. This is how we're going to be different from Hamas, different from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And unfortunately, a lot of the Europeans and a lot of the Arabs, they're still talking about, let's bring in the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority. No one is wanting to seize NCAG as a new opportunity for something different. Even elements of the Trump administration, they want NCAG to be a transitional body for the eventual return of the Palestinian Authority. So that's on one end. Why does that matter? For the other end, it means that, I'm sorry, but Hamas has been in control of Gaza for 20 years. They know every corner, every inch, every tunnel, every hole. And I just worry that having very tightly controlled technocrats that don't have the money, they don't have the executive force, the police force that they've been promised hasn't been trained. They don't have an international stabilization force, an international force that they can basically use for their own protection. It's going to be really difficult for them to go in, disarm Hamas that carried out October 7th, that kicked out the Palestinian Authority, and then for them to actually say, we are now the only sole power. And it sounds like a far-fetched dream to expect the NCAG to quickly and credibly be able to assert control. It is possible. It is doable. But there is an immense amount of work that I don't see any infrastructure going in. I don't see any work. And I see President Trump, I see some of the Board of Peace, I see some of the Arabs talking about, okay, we got the technocrats, they're ready to go. But it almost feels like a joke. And I'm like, any basic student in organizational behavior and leadership, international relations, security, intelligence, national security will tell you this is what you need to empower NCAG. So I'm very nervous because we have a unique window, and I'll stop here, but we have a short window in which the population have turned against Hamas. Most of the people of Gaza, they're against Hamas, they're against the armed resistance narrative, and they want lasting peace. It doesn't mean they're pro-Israel. It doesn't mean they're Zionist. It doesn't mean they think of peace and relations with Israel in the way that all of us here on this call think of it. But it means there's a window to take the people on a journey away from the armed resistance narrative that has dominated Gaza towards the nation-building agenda in pursuit of the coexistence narrative. So that's on one end. And then we have this short window where for now, Hamas has said yes to disarmament. And we have to actually grab that opportunity quickly, lest we waste it on just many more months of essentially going in circles, only for conditions to change come midterm elections, come Israeli elections, come the 2027, and who knows where things will be then.
Thank you so much for that. It certainly looks like we have a real unique opportunity here to take advantage of. When I was looking at the roadmap, I also noted that it really puts immense pressure on the NCAG to immediately assume major responsibilities. So great to hear your thoughts on that. I have a question next for General Amidror, but before I get into it, just like to remind our audience that I will be asking another question or two, and then I do hope to get some of your questions and ask them to our esteemed panel. So again, there's a Q&A feature, the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. Please do feel free to send me any questions there. General Amidror, I wanted to turn to you to talk specifically about this Palestinian police force operating under the NCAG, which the roadmap says will be responsible for internal security in Gaza. But as you had pointed out, Israel may need to also re-enter Gaza to take out terrorist threats. So I was hoping you could talk with us more about this Palestinian police force, what you see as potentially some of the risks or limitations, and are there any lessons learned from PASIF, the Palestinian Authority security force operating in the West Bank, that could be applicable to how we're conceiving of the role of the NCAG police force in Gaza? General, if you could unmute.
In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is too weak to deal with the real problem of Hamas in the West Bank. A few months ago, they tried to enter to one of the refugee camps near Jenin, and after 4 days, they called the IDF to come to help them because they couldn't deal with Hamas. There is a very strong connection between the capabilities of Hamas and the ability of the police to implement its job. The weaker Hamas is, the easier for the police will be to put law and order in the streets, on the streets of Gaza Strip, and this is the main job of this police. There is no No one expects this police to deal with terror organization like Hamas in the future. And this is why, for their success, it is so important to dismantle Hamas before the new Palestinian police is taking responsibility for the streets of Gaza. And people have to understand that there is a connection between the decommissioning of Hamas and the commissioning of the police. And if that will be ignored, and someone will say, okay, we are sending the new police officers after training in Cairo or in Amman, doesn't matter, to deal with the problems in Gaza, they doomed to fail. And we want them to succeed. And their success to put law and order in a place in which there was not law and no order. It was run by a terror organization, which the population afraid from, corruption from A to Z. Nothing was in order according to any law. And this is why it is so important from the Palestinian point of view, from those who want the new police forces to succeed, to dismantle, totally dismantle Hamas. And those who do not understand the connection between the two sides of the equation are not giving any chance to the police to succeed in the future. At the end of the day, we know the truth. No one will fight Hamas. If Hamas will try to rebuild itself in Gaza, we will have to intervene. If there is any chance that the Palestinians will gain life like ordinary people in ordinary places, in countries, just other countries in the Middle East, leave alone United States of America or Israel, it's that Hamas will not be the obstacle, and the only way that Hamas will not be the obstacle is to dismantle Hamas.
Great. Thank you so much for that. John, my next question is for you, but before I get into that, I see that we have a comment from Aaron David Miller I'd just like to share into the conversation. He highlights that it took 7 years to decommission the IRA in Ireland and Protestant military groups, and notes that these armed elements were offered a role in governance. And Hamas is essentially being offered a kick to the exit. John, I'd like to pivot to talk about the International Stabilization Force. I know we already talked about the NCAG police. This is another force talked about in
Just
the
if
roadmap.
I say something, if I can say something of this remark of my
Please, I'd welcome it.
very old colleague, Mr. Miller. Yes, he's right. But the IRA didn't vote to destroy Britain. And Hamas now is promised to destroy Israel. So to compare between what happened with Hamas and what happened with the IRA operatives, I think it's a huge mistake, because you cannot bring into the system people that really believe that Israel should be destroyed.
And if I may just add also to that comment, like, is Hamas's interest is it just to have jobs for its people so that they can have salaries to provide to their families? Or is it so that, which is what I believe their ultimate goal is, to basically become an obstacle, kind of like become the plaque in the artery of the system and cause a heart attack, essentially, that can shock the system into, we can't have normalization with Israel, we can't have a demilitarized Gaza future, we can't walk away from the armed resistance narrative. So I strongly believe that even people in Israel itself would actually support an off-ramp for Hamas members to be integrated as part of the society and to have amnesty. The Trump administration repeated that offer, and I've spoken to senior Trump administration officials who described even frameworks for how that could be implemented. But that's not really what Hamas wants. They want to be part of the system as another way, instead of arms. Now they're just going to go from within and sabotage it. And that's not acceptable, especially for Palestinians, let alone the Arabs or the international community.
Thank you so much. John, I don't know if you would also like to respond to Aaron Miller's comment. If not, I'll proceed with my question for you.
No, I think it's been handled. Thank you.
Right, of course. So Ahmed had talked a little bit before about the status of the ISF, the International Stabilization Force. John, I'd like your thoughts. Essentially, is there today an ISF to speak of? How do you understand its role per the roadmap? And is the ISF the right force for the job that the roadmap gives it?
Um, I think we've had indications that there have been a number of countries that would be willing to deploy under the right, most favorable circumstances, as General Amador says, where they don't have to be responsible for actually fighting Hamas. That we've seen some Moroccan forces, I think, have begun to deploy. There have been some commitments from countries like Kosovo, Albania, I think. Perhaps Uganda is even in the discussion of participating. But in terms of exact numbers and capabilities, and under what exact rules of engagement, we don't know. This roadmap sets out that the ISF would have no policing function, no peace enforcement function. Once it deploys, it would, as you said, I think, be a more of a buffer force deploying in between Israel and the new Palestinian administration. It would do what it could to support the new administration in non-policing functions. It would train police. It would help ensure the delivery and security of humanitarian supplies into Gaza and that they actually reach the Gazan civilians free of the kind of Hamas interference that Ahmed talked about. I'm sure there are issues with border protection in between Egypt and Gaza, working with the IDF and others to ensure smuggling of weapons into terrorist forces was not occurring. So a range of things that they could do, but very much in a classical, I suppose, peacekeeping kind of function rather than actually any role in enforcing the peace and keeping the terrorists at bay. You do worry. I've always and long worried, and our task force that we had in 2023 and 2024 worried greatly about inserting any kind of sovereign forces, much less sovereign Muslim or Arab forces, in between the IDF and a new Palestinian administration, for fear that at some point, like a UNIFIL in Lebanon, they become more of a cover and protective force for the reconstitution and rebuilding of the terrorists, as Hezbollah was able to manipulate and use UNIFIL for, and it becomes a force that constrains the IDF's freedom of action, if need be, to go back in and handle something that a Palestinian police force either can't handle or refuses to handle. That it becomes more a constraint on Israel in providing for its security than it becomes a constraint on the terrorists themselves. And once, you worry about the first time that there's evidence in some Palestinian camp of Hamas reconstituting itself, planning new operations against Israel. The IDF tells the International Stabilization Force, hey guys, we have this intelligence. Stand down, stand aside, tell the Palestinian police to do the same. Either they can take care of this problem, or if not, they stand aside and we're going in to take care of this problem in this Palestinian camp. And you can see the International Stabilization Force, or Palestinian police saying this is unacceptable, we're not going to do it, and suddenly you have a clash between the IDF and some sovereign international force that is there, and you've got an international incident or something worse, some kind of miscalculation or something goes wrong. So I do worry significantly about that, Rena, and you obviously hope for the best, but you've got to believe incidents are going to occur. And we have to figure out how we handle that. There was something in the that was hopeful, I think, in an explanation that the Board of Peace put out after unveiling the roadmap, in which they talked about, yes, the Palestinian administration would have responsible for internal security matters strictly, but not for external security issues, which you imagine is a way to acknowledge without explicitly acknowledging that Israel might have a role in external threats that it sees emerging from Gaza and would retain some freedom of action. But that's got to be really explicitly worked out, at least behind the scenes, between Israel, the Board of Peace, the United States, the guarantors. So there's no misunderstanding about what Israel's ultimate authorities would be if, in fact, new security threats emerge, because, as General Amidor says, it's hard to imagine any other force being willing to confront some kind of a new emerging threat from Hamas or other terror organizations inside of Gaza.
Great. Thank you so much, John. In our last few minutes, I have one more closing question, but before that, General Amidror, I just wanted to give you a chance if you did want to respond to John's thoughts and some of the concerns he raised on deploying a multinational force like the ISF to Gaza, where it would be a buffer between the NCAG and IDF.
Look, we have long experience, in most of the cases, very bad one, with international forces. I can begin with the story. I was a young soldier in the Six-Day War when we moved slowly into Gaza. After crossing the border, we got an order to stop moving and to cease our fire because the United Nations forces are moving out. And within 15, 20 minutes, we saw Indian forces with the guns down to show that they don't have any bad intention, marching within the railroad, coming from Gaza out to the north, towards Israel. They had been evacuated. When they were needed, they were not there. For 3 years, I was the intelligence commander of the intelligence of the Israeli intelligence, military intelligence in the Northern Command. And UNIFIL was very good for Hezbollah and very bad for the IDF. They afraid from Hezbollah. They didn't report about Hezbollah. They helped Hezbollah. And we were very cautious not to hit any member of UNIFIL. And for us, UNIFIL was an obstacle, not the force which helped us to keep the peace in the north. And so on and so forth. And this is why it is so important, and this is why we are insisting that the dismantling of Hamas will be prior to any retreat of the IDF. Because if Hamas does not exist as a military force inside Gaza Strip, is another story. If Hamas still exists as a military force, as a terror organization within the Palestinian society in Gaza, that will be something that we will have to deal with from time to time, and the international forces will be an obstacle. If Hamas was dismantled and does not exist as a terror organization, there are people who believe in Hamas ideas, Muslim Brotherhood, and so on and so forth, but they don't have the ability to harm Israel. They don't have the weapon. They don't have the organization. They don't have the command and control system. They are not collecting intelligence about it. All that is not exist. It's easier to deal with the problems when they emerge, And in this situation, I believe that the part of it can be solved by the international forces. But if Hamas still exists and still has the weapon in his hand, lightweight, and so forth, the international forces will not fight Hamas, and the IDF will have to go in and to do the job. In this case, the international forces are a huge obstacle for future of peace in Gaza.
Thank you so much for that. I realize we're at time, but John, I had one last quick question for you. I'd like your sort of 30-second top lines. What should policymakers and regional experts look for as a sign that the roadmap is moving forward, or alternatively, that it's at the verge of collapse?
It's a good question. I suppose we'll know if we get to a point where the NCAG is in place, some new Palestinian police force is there. They've been allowed to deploy, assert some kind of administrative control and authority, and start actually receiving and collecting the initial heavy weapons, tunnel plans, decommissioning weapons depots and production facilities. I mean, that'll be the ultimate test, I guess, of whether this can go forward and whether it's serious. Again, I think it's going to be a slow process as much as we'd like it to go very fast. It took 9 months to even get to this point. So I think it's going to be take some time. Rena, one idea that I did want to introduce, though, very quickly is just that even if, as we try to pursue this process, there was a parallel process in which, in Israel's part of Gaza, the 70% that it controls, that is really clean of Hamas, that you could even begin there a process by which the NCAG would deploy. You would create some kind of initial new communities, even small ones, 20,000 Palestinians moving from Hamas Gaza into a free Gaza, let's say, to set up an example and a magnet for a functioning community free of Hamas, with the International Stabilization Force helping to ensure security there. That process is an alternative kind of parallel process that might create these islands of success that would become magnets and a sign of momentum in this process, even if this disarmament process in Hamas portions of Gaza doesn't proceed as quickly as we would like. And I think there's still some idea that process in parts of Rafah maybe can go forward very slowly, very incrementally, but hopefully with some signs of success, even as we try to pursue this other much more ambitious process of Hamas disarmament. And I think that's also something we ought to keep an eye out for.
If I may, one remark about the facts on the ground.
Mhm.
There is a tender which was published by the new administration, which is calling for building a camp for 150 Moroccan soldiers inside the Gaza Strip. This is the kind of a beginning of something. The soldiers are not here yet, but at least the tender is here. And this is a signal to everyone that, yes, we are continuing. I think that this is an important step. Of course, the key for everything is the process of dismantling Hamas, but I think that other events around it might help convince the people in Gaza, which are at the end of the day, these are the customers of the process, that something new is emerging. I hope that they will be convinced that then Hamas will be forced to be dismantled.
One thing that I have heard from Palestinian reporting from a journalist who's very close to Hamas is that actually, according to Hamas itself, most of the remaining tunnels that are of concern to Israel are actually in that 70% that Israel controls. So even though on the surface the area is clear of Israel of Hamas, supposedly beneath the surface there remains a significant amount of tunnels because the soil there is very conducive to the type of tunnels, and it's closer to the borders with Israel. It's closer to the areas where Hamas anticipated in the past confrontations with an incoming Israeli onslaught. So that'll be very interesting to watch for. And I know that the Israeli military is regularly, almost daily, uncovering new tunnels in the parts that it controls. But supposedly, Hamas alleges most of the remaining tunnels are in those areas.
Great. Well, on that, I'd like to bring the conversation to a close. Apologies for our viewers that we went a few minutes over, but really think this was an insightful discussion worth everyone's while. I'd like to thank again our panel of esteemed experts on the issue. We have General Yaakov Amidror, John Hanna, and Ahmed Al-Khatib. Thank you again to everyone who logged on to join, and please do stay engaged with JINSA. Keep your eye out for more insights on these important issues. All right, with that, have a good rest of your day and good evening, General in Israel. We'll see you soon. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.